Hello, everyone. My name is Chen Li. I am an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my lab's recent work on dynamic multi-legged locomotion in complex 3D terrain. Before doing so, I want to acknowledge the symposium organizers, Amplo Haley, Alice Gibb, and Sandy Kawano for kindly inviting me into this very nice walking symposium. Hopefully, my talk is going to provide a little bit of a different perspective on legged locomotion in more complex environments. Animals are very good at moving through all kinds of environments. As shown by just a few examples here, we have terrestrial animals that can dynamically transition through different locomotor modes using their legs, and even limbless animals, as you see, to traverse very large obstacles in complex 3D terrain. And we have been envisioning having robots be able to do so as well for several decades now, to help us humans do many different things. You can see here some examples of recently developed terrestrial robots, some of which are already venturing into the real world. For example, robotic vacuums, Mars rovers, and also self-driving cars. The main approach of robots in terms of moving in complex environments is typically by creating a geometric map of its environment and then using it to plan a safe trajectory to avoid obstacles. So here, the self-driving car is classifying other vehicles and pedestrians and cyclists as obstacles and avoiding them by transitioning across different driving modes. The premise for this approach to work well is that you need to have locomotor-environment interaction that is well understood, so that you can control your vehicle or robot to readily follow the planned trajectory precisely. And we are able to do this because we have vehicle and tire dynamics for paved road, as well as terramechanics for off-road vehicle mobility, which have been developed over the last several decades to 100 years. More broadly, we also have these kinds of models describing the locomotor environment interaction for flight and swimming on a very broad scale, thanks to a couple hundred years of aerodynamics and hydrodynamics, entire fields of tools and models being created. And they have not only allowed us to understand how animals move, but also how to create devices that do so in fluid environments. For terrestrial locomotion, we also have made significant progress over several decades. And so far, we have already achieved very high level understanding of near steady state single mode locomotion on relatively simple flat rigid ground. For example, the spring mass model for running, as we are all very well familiar with. And they have also allowed us to not only understand how animals move, but create robots that can do this really well. It is in fact because we understand such fundamental mechanics and dynamics of multi-legged locomotion as well as we do that we have these wonderful legged robots from places like Boston Dynamics. Mark Rayburn, the founder of Boston Dynamics, was in fact a professor early in his career, and he not only understand and appreciate the mechanics and dynamics of legged locomotion, but really focused on creating robots that integrate sensing, control, and planning with tuned mechanics and dynamics to achieve robust locomotion on relatively simple ground. But when we look a bit more broadly, beyond such simple flat surfaces, we can see that in the real world, there are actually more complex terrains such as desert sand or loose Martian soil, or even forest floor and earthquake rubble, where we have lots of heterogeneous large obstacles for which obviously these relatively simple locomotor environment interaction models no longer work. And in fact, we even in many of these cases, we have had a long lack of tools and models to understand this interaction. So in other words, to begin to make progress, we should try to create this new field of terradynamics on the same level of aero and hydrodynamics to better understand such interaction. So I started working towards this when I was still a PhD student with Dan Goldman at Georgia Tech. I focused on legged locomotion on granular media by observing how animals and robots as physical models move on granular media. I created the first Terradynamics of legged locomotion, which is a granular resistive force theory, essentially experimentally mapping out the lift and drag forces of a plate element moving in granular media and integrating them to actually predict the forces and movement during legged locomotion. After my PhD, I began thinking about how to expand Terradynamics into more complex 3D terrain. And when we look back at what we know about legged locomotion in terms of high level advanced understanding using dynamical systems theories, we can see that the majority of our understanding so far has been largely focused on how to generate and how to stabilize single mode near steady state or limit cycle behavior, as we see here. But in these kinds of complex 3D terrain with many large obstacles, obviously animals and robots, they do not always stay near the limit cycle. They get very frequently and substantially perturbed away from limit cycle. And we have a relative lag of even conceptual ideas or frameworks to understand such locomotor transitions. So how do we begin? So when I first started thinking about this, I was a postdoc with Bob Fo at Berkeley. And in Bob's lab, we have all kinds of little critters, such as cockroaches, which Bob's lab has studied for several decades. And for me, someone with a little bit of experience studying locomotion in complex terrain, I decided to look at how cockroaches can go over these kinds of large obstacles, because this is very often found in their natural habitat. But you can see that a forest floor with these obstacles just seems formidable. How do you even get started? So I decided to focus on how they traverse dense vegetation, and I used grass-like beams, which are laser-cut paper assembled into arrays as a model system to enable repeatable systematic experiments. And through this study, this early study, we discovered that these cockroaches can actually make probabilistic and stochastic transitions across many different modes, forming this complex locomotor pathway. So how do you go beyond such a one type of model terrain? And this has been what my lab, one of the major directions my lab has been working on over the last few years. We can classify these very diverse, heterogeneous large obstacles into different types. For example, bumps that you have to move over, gaps that you have to avoid falling into, pillars that are rigid and tall and too tall for you to go over, so you have to go around, and then beams that which can be actually pushed. And also in these kinds of large obstacle environment, the animals often flip over, so there's an additional challenge of self-righting. So our hope is that if we can understand how the animals' locomotor modes and transitions when interacting with these different types of obstacles emerge from the locomotor interaction and how these transitions can be controlled, then perhaps we can piece all this together to better understand such multi-pathway locomotor transitions. We take this interdisciplinary integrative approach at the interface of biology, robotics, and physics. We study animals as model organisms to reveal the capabilities and limits of locomotion. They also provide proof of concept and inspiration for creating bio-inspired robots. With robots, we then use them as physical models to enable precise systematic experiments, which allow us to test and even generate biological hypotheses. We then create physics models, which allows us to discover general principles, as well as coming up with quantitative predictions that can not only help reveal the mechanisms of success and failure in biological locomotion, but also provide design tools and action strategies for improving the performance of robots. Towards this, we have been creating a diversity of tools to enable better measurements of locomotion in complex 3D terrain. For example, here we have this more refined version of grass-like beams in which we focus the bending at the membrane at the base, so that this is much easier to model. We can also control the thickness of the membranes to change the stiffness of these beams, and we can do this for other kinds of obstacles as well. We also develop techniques to integrate many camera recordings to be able to automatically reconstruct the 3D kinematics of the locomotors, as well as the terrain obstacles if they move. And this is in fact not trivial because of the large rotation as well as the occlusions, frequent occlusions. And finally, we also create this terrain treadmill, with which we can keep the animal on top to record for a very long time and over large distances of traversal. Using this diversity of tools, we then study both animals, in this case, legged cockroaches, as well as legged robots as physical models, overcoming this diversity of large obstacles of different types, as well as self-riding. And finally, we can then create a suite of physics models ranging from very simple ones to more complex ones to help reveal the mechanisms and discover general principles. So I won't go into detail of all of these. Mainly, I want to highlight one particular direction, or I guess scenario, of traversing these beam-like obstacles and using a potential energy landscape approach in one project, so that you get an idea of how we do use this interdisciplinary integrative approach to make progress. And we were heavily inspired by early successes in a field of animal locomotion, where people focus first on studying and understanding the passive mechanics and dynamics, very often using feed-forward robotic physical models as seen here, as well as studying animals in the more feed-forward regime. Once you have this as a basis, you can then better understand sensory feedback processes. Yeah, so we study feed-forward robotic physical models as well as animals during escape or emergency self-riding behavior, in which their movement is more feed-forward. With this as a foundation, we then can further study the sensory feedback control. Yeah, so in this project that I want to highlight, we're looking at this transition from what we call a pitch to a roll mode. This is led by my most senior PhD student, Ratan, who is going to start a postdoc pretty soon. So what we're looking at here is these cockroaches transitioning from what we call pitch mode, which is really just pushing down the beams, in which its body has to pitch up slightly due to the restoring torques, into this other mode, which we call roll. You can see the animal here. Before it's able to push across, it very quickly rolls its body into the gap to traverse. So how do we understand how this locomotor mode transition emerges from the physical interaction and how it can be controlled? To model the physical interaction, we consider the simplest physics model that we can think of. We're completely ignoring the dynamics of the system, and we also approximate the animal as just a simple ellipsoid moving, which can translate and rotate. So you can then write down the total potential energy of the system, which is the sum of its gravitational energy, the body and the beams, as well as the elastic energy of the beams. So the total potential energy here is a function of the body position, translational position, the forward and lateral position, as well as its orientation, how it's oriented in the vicinity of the beams, because that's going to then change how much the beams are deflected. And what I'm showing here is just a cross-section cut of the potential energy landscape over the body roll and pitch degrees of freedom. And you can see that there are three local minima basins that have emerged here due to this interaction when the body is very close, right in the middle of the two beams. You see that there's a what we call pitch basin in the very middle, and if the system falls to the minima of that basin, this configuration looks like this. The body slightly pitched up and bending the beams just a little bit. And that is reminiscent of the pitch mode that we see. And there are also these two other basins on the left and right, which corresponds to the body rolling to the left or to the right without deflecting the beams. And these are reminiscent of the animal rolling using this roll mode. So what this suggests is that the animal transitioning from the pitch to the roll mold is perhaps a transition of the system from being attracted to this pitch basin to then overcome this potential energy barrier in between to reach the roll basin. So is that true that this locomotor transition can be viewed as a destabilizing barrier crossing transition? Destabilizing here means that you are destabilizing yourself from this strong attraction into a basin. Further, from my earlier study, you can see that these animals are oscillating their body quite frequently during this interaction because of their intermittent leg propulsion against the ground. So we further hypothesize that if you have sufficient kinetic energy that is greater than your potential energy barrier, is perhaps enough to help you overcome this potential energy barrier to make this transition. And to test this, what Ratan did along with a master student is to build a robotic physical model, which is completely feed-forward. And you can see it is a physical realization of our very simple model. We have a gyroscope mechanism with which it can freely pitch and roll. We can then drive it forward and apply oscillation that can be varied to change the level of kinetic energy. Yeah, so here are our representative trials. You can see that without any body oscillation, the system is stuck in this pitch mode, being right in the middle of the two beams, pushing them down to traverse. Whereas when you have sufficient body oscillation with kinetic energy, you can then very quickly make the transition into this roll mode to traverse. And when we visualize our trials, which are shown here, the dots are the current state and the curves is the trajectory. You can see that for all of these pitch mode trials, the system is indeed strongly attracted to this pitch basin, whereas when it has sufficient kinetic energy, it is able to escape from that basin, overcoming a barrier and reaching this roll basin. And when we quantitatively measure the potential energy barrier as well as the kinetic energy, we found that as you go forward, the potential energy barrier is going to decrease to actually below the kinetic energy over here at this position. And when we measure the location, this mean and standard deviation of where this transition actually happens, it is exactly when the potential energy barrier is lower than the kinetic energy. And this confirmed our hypotheses. And this is not surprising because here we have a feed-forward robotic physical model whose body dynamics, whose transitions is entirely governed by this physical interaction. Further, we can also vary the stiffness of these beams to study how the transition dynamics change when the environment changes. So you can see here when the beams are flimsy on the left here with low stiffness, the system does not make a transition. It just uses this push mode, and that's intuitive because when the beams are very flimsy, it's as if nothing is there. You can just move forward. However, for these high stiffness case, you can see that when the beams become stiffer and stiffer, the system has a higher and higher probability of transitioning from the pitch to the roll mode. And we can understand this using a concept of favorability, terradynamic favorability. What we think is happening is if you look at the how deep these basins are, for example, here, we can see that in this case, with a high stiffness, you pause here, you can see that the pitch basin is actually quite a bit higher than the roll basin. So what this means is that if you're stuck in the pitch mode, when you keep going forward throughout your traversal, your total potential energy of the system, even though it's stuck in that minima or near that minima, is actually going to continue to go up and up. So that's very energetically costly. Whereas if you are able to escape from that basin, overcoming just a small barrier to reach this lower basin, you are actually not going to have a potential energy that keeps going up like this. So what we have found is that for this feed-forward robotic physical model, this transition, it passively, simply driven by the physics of this interaction, it transitions from a less favorable to a more favorable mode. Whereas on this extreme, the pitch basin itself is already the deepest basin. So you just stay there. A question you might already be wondering about is how can we go from this potential energy landscape model, which completely ignores dynamics, to actually predict the dynamics of locomotor transitions. This is something we're still working on, but here's a proof of concept led by my PhD student, Shihan. We can write down the equation of motion of the system by applying Newton's second law. On the left here, we have the inertial force, mass times acceleration. And on the right here, we have all the external forces, including potential energy landscape gradient, which describes conservative forces, including gravity and elastic force, as well as actually self-propulsion, because that's going to drive the system forward, which changes the potential energy landscape. And on the right here, we have, we also have these dissipative force terms, and as well as random force. Here we just assume a viscous drag as a proof of concept. Obviously, we still need to perform experiments to better characterize and model these other forces. But with this very simple toy model, we can see that we can actually generate a dynamic simulation here, which is very similar to what we see in experiment. When we have a large level of random force, it is going to help the system from being attracted to this pitch basin to actually overcome a barrier to find the roll basin. Whereas if you have very little random force, you're stuck in that basin. Finally, Ratan also studied how animals make this transition, basically repeating the kinds of experiments and analyses, obviously scaled down for the animal in terms of the obstacle, and found that everything is consistent except one thing, that is when the transition happens for the animal, it is in fact where the potential energy barrier has come down and become comparable, but still quite a bit higher than the kinetic energy. And this suggests that there has to be something active going on, that the animal is very likely using sensory feedback control to change its own actuation to perhaps inject more directed energy, mechanical energy, or even perhaps to bring down the potential energy barrier to facilitate this transition, which our very simple model doesn't capture. Yeah, so towards understanding this, my other PhD student, Yaqing, had recently performed this follow-up study where he had quantified in great detail the body and the leg kinematics. And he found that the animal is tucking its legs in right before this transition, most likely to reduce roll stability. It seems to be extending one hind leg while retracting another, which is most likely to generate a roll torque. We don't know yet because we don't have force measurements. But very interestingly, the animal also flexes head up and down very frequently before this transition. And after the transition, when it's within the gap rolled in between, it also flexes abdomen along with the head. And we think that these are likely to use the mechanical receptors within the body to sense this physical interaction with the environment and also to break the interlocking or frictional contact. So to understand the principles of such sensory feedback control, Yaqing has recently developed a refined robot in which he has actuators to flex the head and the abdomen, as well as actuators to control the body pitch roll, as well as translation in an actuated manner. And he also instrumented it with several force sensors, allowing him to measure the contact force against the environment. And we're hoping to use this as a system to systematically discover how to sense and use physical interaction intelligently. As a proof of concept, here is a recent study led by my PhD student, Shihan, where he had this very simple rigid body robot, or animal, if you will, that can detect the contact forces and use that to infer how stiff the beams are. So in this case, it initially does not let the robot have any sensory feedback. It has a limited ability to generate forward propulsion. So you can see that against stiff beams, it's not able to push forward. However, once he enables this environmental force sensing, he can then use it to switch from a pitch to a roll mode to traverse. So I have highlighted our studies of beam traversal as an example to show how we can use this interdisciplinary integrative approach to make progress. And we have done this for several other scenarios, as I have already mentioned in the beginning, and we found that there are surprisingly general principles. First, the locomotion or locomotor transitions in each of these is quite stochastic, but actually also very stereotyped. For each one of them, we discovered there are actually only about 2 to 3 dominant modes and transitions. And this is because when you apply this potential energy landscape approach, we found that for each of these, the interaction results in only maybe 2 or 3 very deep landscape basins to which the system is strongly attracted. So that emerges as the modes, and the transitions emerges when the system is able to cross these barriers to hop between modes. And further, we empirically in our experiments, we discovered many control and planning strategies which can actually help increase the performance of traversal or self-riding. And when we look back using this potential energy landscape approach or framework, we found that this can be understood in as 3 different categories of strategies. First, you can do something active to steer yourself on the landscape. Second, you can change the landscape barrier, either to bring it up or to lower it to decrease or increase the probability of transitioning into a mode, depending on whether it is undesirable or it is desirable. And finally, you can even add or remove landscape basins, basically changing the topology of the landscape to eliminate or to introduce new locomotive modes. And if you're interested, we have a review paper just published less than a year ago, which summarizes all this. So what all of this we think is pointing us to is that there are perhaps new dynamical systems theories waiting to be discovered for locomotive transitions. Beyond such limit cycle behavior, which can capture running off or walking on flat ground, there might be other more transient attractors that are yet to be discovered, which can describe such strong attraction into such deep potential energy landscape basins. And if we are able to create such models, this is going to give us a more complete dynamical systems theory framework to allow us to understand not only steady or near steady state single mode locomotion, but actually locomotive transitions across modes. So our longer term goal is that with these fundamental environmental interaction models, we can further discover how to intelligently sense, control, plan, and learn how to act upon these physical interactions to be able to actually traverse a large diversity of obstacles. And this will complement the existing approaches of using geometric maps to avoid obstacles. And the ultimate dream is that once we have such fundamental physics or terradynamics of interaction with a diversity of complex terrain beyond the ones that I have briefly reviewed here, we are going to really have not only the ability to understand how animals move across really complex real world, but also to truly enable robots to make an impact on many different parts of our society. And towards this broader goal, I think that we as a field studying animal locomotion will really benefit from more studies of organisms moving in more realistic environments, going beyond really the relatively simple environments that we have done for a long time. And this is going to be very challenging, but also very fruitful. And in this endeavor, using robotic physical models is going to really help us because they can complement animal studies as well as pure theoretical or simulation studies, as they can address many of the challenges that we can encounter using these other approaches. And there have been quite a few papers as well as a book that had already touched upon many of these ideas that I listed here. And finally, of course, we should have more interdisciplinary and integrative training and teamwork as a community to better facilitate this process. So I would like to acknowledge all my lab members, especially my PhD students and postdocs, who have led most of the work that I reviewed here. Also many colleagues, including my advisors, who have provided many inspiring discussions. And of course, the funding sources that have supported our work.